Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Friday edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you so very much for tuning in yet again. Today's show should be a fantastic one as we have made it to the end of the week, but for the first time ever in the history of the podcast, my player profiles are switching from the offensive side of the football to the defensive side of the football. Yes, for all you IDP nerds out there watching, this episode is for you. Every single segment will focus on a specific defensive player and why I believe they are an intriguing fantasy option for your IDP rosters. But before we begin and deep dive into all five of these exciting, exhilarating players, I do want to remind you yet again to like, follow, and subscribe to the show and the network as a whole. It's a huge support to everyone concerned. We do also receive a ton of tips and donations, so if you feel so inclined, please consider leaving them at the link gsmc.cloud. It is a huge support to both me, my fellow podcasters, and ultimately the network as a whole. If you also have any burning questions, comments, or concerns about prior segments I've done on my show or also ones I do today, please feel free to leave them there and they will be addressed at the beginning of the next episode. But without further ado, let's jump right into the IDP player profiles for today. And in fact, we'll stay on the screen to talk about our first player. Now, when I look at all five players that I chose to dissect for today's show, I can make the case that arguably at least 4 out of the 5 players are considered the top 4 or 5 players in the league in terms of their defensive prowess. And so this is going to be a very top-heavy episode, loaded with guys who are going to go very high in the draft, and this guy is no different. Perhaps the best linebacker in the league, we don't know yet. He's still young, and he's still improving, and he's on a defense that is constantly looking to make the most out of what they have in this young man, and that, of course, is Micah Parsons of the Dallas Cowboys. And so I generally feel like Micah Parsons is going to be one of those people who really steps up his game for the Cowboys at any given week, mainly due to the fact that at this current moment in time, the Cowboys defense looks as versatile as ever, mainly due to the fact that they have everyone at different positions, especially in their front seven, that can affect getting to the quarterback in different ways. What's interesting also at the 5 players I've selected is that, for the most part, they're getting new defensive coordinators, so there adds a little bit of mystery and intrigue as to how all these players are going to line up. But the biggest one that I'm not concerned about right now is Micah Parsons. So let's jump right into what makes Micah Parsons such a special athlete. Though his career has accumulated 478.8 IDP points, his best season, though, was his rookie season in where he accumulated 173.95 fantasy points. Last year was a very good year for him. He was nominated for the Defensive Player of the Year award. 40 tackles, 14 sacks, 40 solo tackles, 64 tackles, 14 sacks, 64 tackles overall. 7th in the league, and of course 1 forced fumble. Now, in the context of the Dallas Cowboys defense, this is where he really excites me as a player, Micah Parsons, because Mike Zimmer comes into the Dallas Cowboys as their new defensive coordinator, and what I see is that he's going to really focus on not just the versatility and coverage schemes, but the simulated pressures. He's going to use twists and stunts to use different guys in that front seven to create pressure to get to the quarterback. They've always kind of played a 3-4 system. They're really focused on power in the front 3 and kind of versatility and depth at the linebacker positions. And when you have a guy like Micah Parsons, he can really slot right in any position. And so what I really appreciate about the way the Cowboys are probably going to scheme around Micah Parsons, because we don't necessarily know what Mike Zimmer is going to bring to the table, is that they're really going to focus on allowing Micah Parsons to get to certain spots where he's not just, going after the quarterback, but he's becoming a smarter player. And in terms of caveats, I feel kind of weird saying that, but if they do that, I don't really have any with Micah Parsons, because this Cowboys defense is all about allowing different players to show off different attributes. You have guys up front like DeMarcus Lawrence, Asa Odighizuwa, who combine their strength with their speed and power. Asa Odighizuwa kind of coming in as the anchor, the defensive anchor up front. And you have guys on the back end who really make sure that these guys can get home. And Deron Bland, who had a career year in terms of interceptions, and Trayvon Diggs, who also had a career year just 2 short years ago as well in that category, who will make sure that the front seven is comfortable getting to the quarterback and have enough time to as well. And so, when you have that defensive structure that combines every single element of each and every one of your players to the best of their abilities, then a guy like Micah Parsons, who is more than just a hybrid role, is really heightened. And no matter what Mike Zimmer wants to do in this system, Micah Parsons is always going to be the danger man. You can have guys like Lawrence and Odighizuwa who can get to the quarterback, and that's fine and dandy. But Micah Parsons adds that extra level of attack because he can line up everywhere. He can line up off the edge. He can be in the linebacker position. I think that if there were any caveats that I would really nitpick on, it's his side-to-side coverage skills. He's not necessarily the best coverage linebacker in terms of his ability to A, clog the run lanes, and B, also defend the pass. But he's primarily so fearsome due to the fact that he's already on top of you before you can even get a pass off. And no matter what, Micah Parsons is such a force, whether or not Mike Zimmer wants to vary up this defense a little bit more. But at the moment, if they play the way they can play, where they offer versatility in coverage, where they're simming pressure, where you allow Micah Parsons to roam free, that's the beauty of the Cowboys defense. Which brings me to the caveat for Micah Parsons that probably is just going to be a small thing, especially for fantasy leagues as well. But there does seem to be a point in the season where the Cowboys defense does kind of stagnate. And maybe it's because, there's a lot of pressure building on that front seven to get home. And while there's definitely talent in terms of the secondary, and we've talked about that talent, I think that the secondary just wants to focus on allowing their players to get home. They believe that their front seven is so good that maybe sometimes they might lose focus on the fact that if you can get throws off in a timely manner and relieve pressure on your QB, then at some pertinent points you'll be able to pick and choose your spots as to how to attack this defense. And so that's my only worry. If there is that kind of stagnation where for some reason the Dallas Cowboys defense does not play up to par, then that's where I worry about Micah Parsons. Another thing that I'm kind of worried about with Micah Parsons is now he's kind of seen as not just a developmental player anymore. He's not in that learning stage where he's just trying to incorporate himself in this Dallas defense. And people will say he didn't even have to. He's at a point where he can be the leader of this defense. And at some points, I really like the confidence he brings. But sometimes he can become too hyper-focused on that confidence, almost to the point that it might be detrimental to the defense itself. Because you can have the drive to be a fantastic defensive player, but you also have to have the focus and ability to realize that there are 11 guys on the field around you. And at some points, you might want to... I'm not saying that Micah Parsons is not going to have fantastic stats next year. I believe he will. He'll be a fantastic IDP player for you. I think he's going to go in the first round, maybe even number 1 overall. But I just want to key you into the fact that Micah Parsons at this point in his career all has to learn how to create for others, because this defense for the past couple of years has started to kind of center around him a little bit. And maybe that's also the reason why stagnation is something that comes to mind when we talk about the Dallas Cowboys defense, because when a team relies on a young star, no matter how much talent he brings to that position, it can create this kind of big-headedness that's really dangerous when you have such a fantastic defense so focused on each and every single player's elements combining to create a fantastic whole that's so collectively compact in the way they defend teams. And so that's my only fear with Micah Parsons, because I love that he gets the stats that you want, because stats are very important, especially in fantasy. But I also want him to be a mature player who can come into the system, whatever Mike Zimmer presents to him, and say, okay, I'm accepting of it, and this is what I have to do to ultimately help my team reach the heights that they need to succeed. It's not just about me at this point in my career. It's about DeMarcus. It's about Asa Digizua. It's about Duran. It's about Trayvon Diggs. So, overall, Micah Parsons is still going to go very high in IDP drafts. But just know that there are other players right now at the point in their careers who can say that they succeed outside of themselves. And that's what I want to see Micah Parsons do. That'll just about do it for this segment. Coming next, we transition to another linebacker who is also in the reckoning to be the linebacker 1 in IDP as well. A guy who already has a Defensive Player of the Year. Tune in to find out who that is after the break on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, I'm losing shit. A stupid myth, you choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody...
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I hope you enjoyed that first segment of Micah Parsons, because he truly is someone who I believe is going to be in the reckoning for the number 1 overall pick in most IDP drafts. But this next guy who I'm going to talk about is definitely also a threat to go as high as that. But before we get into who that young man is, just want to remind you yet again that if you do feel so inclined, please consider leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. It is a huge support to both me, my fellow podcasters, and ultimately the network as a whole. So anything you leave is greatly appreciated. Without further ado, let's jump right into the fantasy player profile of TJ Watt, another special young linebacker in this league. We've already seen the impact he's having on the league defensively, especially on a Steelers defense that prides itself on being the best unit on this team, that prides itself on helping this team grind out victories when their offense really hasn't been as good as, prior Steelers offenses. And so, when I'm looking at TJ Watt and comparing him with Micah Parsons, yes, Micah Parsons is more versatile, but TJ Watt just gets so much production because he understands that everyone around him can impact the game as well. He plays with a desire not to get a sack, or get an interception, or force a fumble. He plays with a desire to help his defense. And that's kind of the difference here. That's why I kind of lean more towards TJ Watt as a linebacker who you want in an IDP draft. And let's jump right into why. So we obviously know in 2021 he won the Defensive Player of the Year award. Throughout his career, he's accumulated 1,106.5 fantasy points in IDP. That is a lofty number. His best season was in 2021 with 203.25 IDP fantasy points, 38 solo tackles last year, 4 passes defended, led the league in sacks with 19, 158.3 fantasy points, 8 passes defended as a linebacker, 4 forced fumbles, that was 5th in the league, also had an interception. And so, overall, production-wise, TJ Watt is beyond Micah Parsons right now, and he's proven himself in this league. But I think that there are more caveats that come with the baggage of TJ Watt. And it's not to do necessarily with himself or the player that he is or the person that he is. It's more to do with the personnel that's surrounding him with. And when I look at the Steelers and compare with the Cowboys, the Steelers' personnel that they have at their disposal, I think, is way not as talented, but certainly feels like they're piecing together players that fit around a certain structure, a certain mindset, a certain trait or attribute. They don't have another TJ Watt, so to speak. But just this past offseason, I think they added a guy who's just going to be as integral to what the Steelers' defense can be this year as TJ Watt, and that is Patrick Queen, because he's finally someone who can take the pressure off TJ Watt, but also was kind of the quarterback of the Ravens defense. So he was not necessarily a second fiddle player in that Ravens system. And the Ravens defense last year was one of the best in the league, if not the best in the league in people's opinions. And so, looking at the depth the Steelers have in defense, they're certainly built more about physicality and grit in the way. They still play the 3-4 defense, but last year was also the year that they play a lot of dime and nickel packages, which shows kind of a shift with their secondary, which, ironically enough, is one of the weaker units in that, in my humble opinion, in that Steelers defense. They have some strong players. Minka Fitzpatrick, shout out to him, went to my high school. They have some strong players in that secondary, but it's certainly not featured as prominently, so to speak, as the grit they have in that front seven. Outside of TJ Watt, really, they didn't have a guy who really pops out at you. I mean, they have Larry Ogunjobi as a defensive front player. They have Cole Holcomb. He's an interesting hybrid kind of linebacker who I like in coverage, but hasn't really proven himself. And Alex Highsmith is just like a do-it-all, every-man kind of linebacker. But adding Patrick Queen in many ways makes a lot of sense, but it also hinders what TJ Watt brings as a leader to this team. Because the reason TJ Watt is able to produce at such a high level, get the stats that you need in IDP, is because he cares about this team. Because he's the leader of that defense. Because he understands the nuances that the defensive coordinator, Terrell Austin, wants to implement. Terrell Austin's also a young defensive coordinator, so it's his second year, and he's implementing this defense, and he really needed TJ Watt to come forward and help these players understand the nuances of it. And the reason why I bring up the only caveat being Patrick Queen is because Micah Parsons, in comparison, really is kind of all on his own. When I think of that front seven for Dallas, I just think of those three guys: DeMarcus Lawrence, Odigizua, and Micah Parsons, because each of them combine the traits you need in your front seven to succeed, especially in, say, a 3-4 defense or a 4-3 defense even. With the Steelers playing more of a 3-4, they have more opportunities to create from the linebacker position. And so, TJ Watt is still perhaps the number one linebacker. He's going to be the guy who ultimately makes the decisions in that front seven in terms of how you play. He's going to be all over the field, creating opportunities, getting to the football, ultimately helping his teammates. But Patrick Queen can do that as well. And he really fits the mold of what the Steelers want as kind of an anchor in that linebacker group. In a 3-4 defense, linebackers certainly have the choice. They can rush the passer, they can drop into coverage, they can do whatever they want. They can go sideline to sideline. If you have, say, TJ Watt on the outside, blitzing the quarterback, rushing the quarterback, and you have Patrick Queen kind of the anchor who stays in coverage, who makes sure the back end is locked down, that system, to me, will really bring out the best in both players. However, if Patrick Queen immediately establishes himself as a leader in this locker room, as someone who sees himself almost as equal to TJ Watt, then that could be a problem. It's kind of weird to bring in player hierarchy into fantasy, but it definitely matters, because you can be a fantastic, athletic, defensive player, but it doesn't mean anything if you can't translate that into whoever steps up or is acquired in your position group. Because there has to be some sense of delineation of who is going to play what role. Because it's all fine and dandy when you know you're the leader, and you know that you are going to be the everyman in that system. And that's what TJ Watt was. That's before Patrick Queen got here. Patrick Queen is a perfect 3-technique player. He is a leader, and he is going to come in, and who knows, maybe he frees up more space for TJ Watt to put up the production people want in IDP leagues, and that could certainly be the case. In fact, I view that as the only case as to what can happen, because it would just make perfect sense. But sometimes there's no gray area in how to define defense, because you have so many defensive systems you can play. You look at the players you have, and you line up the way that suits them. But in many ways, the best moments that a defense plays come out of structure. And Patrick Queen coming into the Steelers certainly feels like it will add structure, but it can also be kind of a chaotic dichotomy here, where you have to view both players through the lens of them being very specific in terms of the areas they perform in. Do you believe that Patrick Queen will allow TJ Watt to do what he does best and rush the passer? Or do you believe that Patrick Queen, as that anchor, will have more say in how the linebacker group plays? And so it certainly seems like the Patrick Queen move was about fit, but it also could be more about value. And I think both of these players are valuable, and I really hope and pray that they're allowed to do what each of them are comfortable with, the player hierarchy at the end of the day really matters in terms of how we view these players through a nutshell. And I would certainly say that TJ Watt, I'm more confident in drafting in terms of Micah Parsons. He's ahead of him statistically. He's ahead of him, I believe, mentally. He understands the Steelers' defense to a T. But I'm also kind of worried about what fit versus value is going to mean for the Steelers' defense, especially with a coordinator who seemingly is allowing all these players to have a lot of control over what they run. So, with these two linebackers, I really think they're the cream of the crop. But tread carefully with both of them, because they both have deeper internal issues and conflicts within their teams that might hinder them. But that should just about do it for those two linebacker segments. We're at the midway point of the show. Coming next, one of the most feared edge rusher in the league comes into question in my player profile series. You don't want to miss this as I talk about one of my favorite defensive players as a whole when we come back on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search...
Hello everyone and welcome back yet again to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I hope you guys are enjoying the show because this segment is about to really make this show very exciting, especially for me because I get to talk about one of my favorite players in terms of not just the defensive side of the football, but also in the NFL because he's one of the most fearsome edge rushers. And now, seeing as how he's in a defense that really is going to make him stand out, I think he's going to go very high on IDP draft boards. And that player, if we switch to this screen right here, is Myles Garrett. Myles Garrett, as soon as he came into the league, everyone knew he was going to be special. But the problem was, he was an anomaly in a Browns defense that didn't really allow him to play to his strengths. He was a perfect blend of size, speed, and strength, and power moves, but no one was able to complement him. But this year, after a career year that saw him win the 2023 Defensive Player of the Year award, Myles Garrett is more poised than ever to continue to see his star ascend and maybe get the Browns deeper into the playoffs than they've ever been in their history. And so, talking about Myles Garrett as not just a defense but fantasy prospect is really exciting, especially this year, because he gets his due flowers in a system that finally fits him. So without further ado, let's jump right into what makes him so special. He's accumulated 858.76 fantasy points throughout his career. His best year was in 2021, 217.65 fantasy points from him. He had 125 tackles overall. He had 2 fumble recoveries, 42 tackles, 33 solo, 17 TFLs last year, 30 QB hits, 4 forced fumbles, 1 fumble recovery. An incredible year last year for Myles Garrett. Truly the center of a Browns defense that's finally becoming one of the best in the league under Jim Schwartz, who was a first-year coordinator, really allowing this defense to grow into itself. It should only get better, especially on the front seven. And that's why I really believe that, much like both Micah Parsons and TJ Watt, there are very few caveats for selecting Myles Garrett. Because when you look at this defensive front, I really love the players they got to complement Myles Garrett. Because Myles Garrett wants to focus on using his size, speed, and strength to get to the pass. He's an all-around defensive end who really is a code breaker in terms of how he fits the system, because even though the Browns play a 4-3 and they are very aggressive in stopping the run, you need certain players along your front, especially at both ends, to really wreak havoc on opposing offenses. And so, it's Darius Smith and Dalvin Tomlinson. I really think you got the perfect guys to complement Myles Garrett. And Darius Smith, you just have a savvy guy who's not necessarily focused on getting to the running back, or quarterback rather, but also just creating space for others. Yes, he can get sacks himself, but he just provides a lot of space for other edge rushers to get to their spots, ultimately make good defensive plays happen. And in Dalvin Tomlinson, you just get a man-eater in the middle. He can concentrate on taking the offensive tackles away, so both Smith and Garrett can focus on the guards on the outside. And so I really, really like how the Browns are developing their defense to truly make their stars shine. And Jim Schwartz, I think, really is just more focused on allowing these guys to play freely, allowing these guys to understand that if they just play with a passion and zeal for the game, then that's what makes them fantastic. I think Jim Schwartz is just a man manager, like they say in soccer or football, as they call it across the pond. He just manages the players so well and just allowing them to interpret what they see on the field. And that's why the Browns are a dangerous prospect, and that's why Myles Garrett is one of the best defensive players in the league. Now, if there were truly any caveats, it's not actually on the defensive side of the ball, because defense is perfectly built to sustain what they did in 2023. It's just a matter of the pressure the offense puts on them, especially an offense that has had so many injuries within it over the past couple of years. And should a star offensive player go down, let's say Deshaun Watson goes down like he did last year, and Joe Flacco's not coming up off his couch. In fact, he's going to be at Indy for the year. You're stuck with a guy like DTR who really isn't that competent of a quarterback just yet in terms of as a backup doing what you want him to do. What's going to happen to a defense that suddenly has so much pressure on it? They really rose to the occasion last year and really was the force the defense needed. But if anything, I think that the Browns' offense is even more vulnerable this year because, A, not only is Deshaun Watson coming back from injury, but Nick Chubb as well. And so, if both your quarterback and running back are rusty, those are the two guys you really rely on, especially in Kevin Stefanski's offensive system. Like, if your quarterback and running back are not up to full fitness, then that's really detrimental. And it could really screw over where the Browns' defense starts in terms of field position. It could really wear and tear on them if your offense is just consistently 3 and out, 3 and out, 3 and out. And I certainly believe that if there's any defense that might be able to overcome that, it's definitely the Browns. But there are still certain weaknesses in this defense. Like, as much as I love the secondary and Martin Emerson and Greg Newsome are coming into their own at the corner positions, when you are playing in the AFC North, and especially conference games as well, you really have to key in on these vertical passing attacks that are transitioning into today's NFL. And you really have to understand that when you're playing in divisional game, it's going to be really tougher than ever. We see it every single year when the Browns play within the division and in their conference. There's really physical games. And at some points, the Browns might not fully be in it. And that's where the defense is going to have to make its bones this year. In those moments where the Browns could be struggling. In moments where the offense isn't getting going. There have to be moments of magic from everyone on that defense, not just Myles Garrett. Myles Garrett is always going to have production. I know it's cliche to say that with all of these players, but they're all going to have their production. But it needs to come in timely manners in order for, defensive players to not be hurt. Because that's another thing. Fatigue matters in defense as well. Not just player hierarchy, but fatigue as well. And we've seen Myles Garrett be mortal. It was during the COVID era when he caught COVID and he came back. We've seen him be mortal. So there truly is no perfect NFL defender. And Myles Garrett realizes that. But I truly believe that this Browns defense has the opportunity to be special. And while Myles Garrett is a huge part of it, I really think the focus for them this year is just understanding the preparedness that might be asked of them. They rose up to the occasion last year. I want to see them replicate it if something goes awry offensively. And so Myles Garrett is definitely a tone setter in terms of IDP. I think he is also in the reckoning to go number 1 overall just because of his special traits and what he brings to this defense and the way they're trying to complement him to the best of their abilities. So, with Myles Garrett, he's the closest thing to a perfect defender you're going to get, but let's see how he handles another 17-game season where his offense might not be up to par. And that's all I have on one of my favorite players in the league, in Myles Garrett. But coming up next on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, we switch over to another bad man in the defensive front, in Nick Bosa. That should be a very interesting segment. We'll be right back on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast to talk more about him.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back yet again to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. We are in the home stretch of the show, and this next segment really complements my last segment as well, because this guy's another defensive end who's really wreaking havoc in this league, proving himself to be one of the best players in the league, and the better brother in this case. It is, of course, Nick Bosa. I really believe that Nick Bosa, in one of the league's most versatile defenses, really transcends what the 49ers defense can do. Because all of these defenses are going to talk about, perhaps bar one, but they certainly have the pieces to do that, are the top defenses in the league. The Cowboys, the Steelers, the Browns, and now the 49ers are all top defenses in the league. And each of the players I'm highlighting, especially Nick Bosa in particular, really have made a name for themselves by being the emotional leaders and the leaders in terms of stats for all these teams, just by sheer physicality and understanding of the nuances of the game. But Nick Bosa just might be the best out of all of them because he's in the system that really works for him the best. And I say this because when I look at the 49ers, I would say, collectively speaking, they have the best, most talented players on their defense. But out of all these teams, they might not necessarily have the best defensive identity. I think that it's just because they're so overwhelmingly talented and understand each other so well that as a result, they play well and are one of the top defenses in the league. They're very well coached. They just hired a new defensive coordinator, though, with Nick Sorensen. So that idea of these individual players coming together and making this defense what it is over the defensive identity of some of these other teams and players that I've talked about previously certainly adds up to why Nick Bosa is so pivotal in this system. So without further ado, let's go over some of his stats from last year. 10.5 sacks, 34 solo tackles, 53 overall. 156 tackles in his career, 43 sacks as well, and only 51 regular season games as well. 590.5 fantasy points throughout his career. His best season was in 2022 when he had 170.75. And so, when I'm talking about the 49ers defense, and I look at the 49ers defense, I see definitely the versatility I've talked about in other defenses. I see the way they build. I see the way they are complementing the pieces that make them so good, especially Nick Bosa. And while I'm certainly intrigued by the players, my main thing is the identity. And it kind of feels weird to say that the San Francisco 49ers of all defenses as an identity crisis, but it certainly seems to me as if it's starting to become the Nick Bosa show a little bit. And they certainly have the players where it doesn't have to be. And while I'm sitting here telling you the reasons why Nick Bosa is going to be drafted very highly in IDP leagues, I think he's going to go at least in the top 5. I'm sitting here thinking that maybe it's now time for someone else in the San Francisco 49ers to supplement that. Because I look at all these players, and yes, they're the true standout stars on all their teams. But I'm looking at the reasons as to why maybe they're not going to perform, and I see so many other talents, whether it be in the secondaries of these other defenses, in the front sevens of these different defenses, that I wouldn't be surprised if another player emerges and has a breakout season. With Nick Bosa, I see the ways they're building around him, but I just feel like it's always Nick Bosa that I hear about. And while it's not necessarily detrimental to them, I just want someone different from the San Francisco 49ers to step into the limelight. I feel as if we're overshadowing players like Leonard Floyd, who just came over. We're overshadowing guys like Drake Greenlaw. We're overshadowing guys like Fred Warner. We're overshadowing guys like Hufanga and Ward on the back end. I feel as if in order for the 49ers to find that identity, they have to find out the reason why Nick Bosa's always the guy that's producing for them. I feel like no matter what, they know as a team that Nick Bosa is always going to get the pressure, make the play, and so, collectively speaking, their whole identity revolves around, oh, maybe Nick Bosa's got it. If that mindset starts to creep in, then I don't necessarily see the 49ers truly buying into trying to build that identity. I think Nick Sorensen coming in now really needs to help them get out of the Nick Bosa mindset, because it's dangerous. And I think that in comparison with Micah Parsons, that's one of the players that I think of that I've mentioned before that's kind of similar. Nick Bosa is still further ahead in his career than him, but he's also, mainly focused on just getting to the quarterback. I think that what's important for him now is that whatever Nick Sorensen tells him to do, he now as the leader of the defense is like, hey guys, so we have to collectively as a group figure out how to get you guys more production. Because they probably will, because it's the San Francisco 49ers. They always get production from everywhere. But collectively speaking, I can't pinpoint different players who I'm really confident can overtake Nick Bosa. Like, Leonard Fournette is a fantastic edge rusher. He's a fantastic player. But is he really going to be on par with Nick Bosa? When I think of Micah Parsons, I think that, DeMarcus Lawrence can hold his own with him. I think that on the back end, Trayvon Diggs and Deron Bland can hold their own. I think with TJ Watt, Patrick Queen now comes in, and, TJ Watt might not be the top dog anymore even, if they play their cards that way. And with Myles Garrett, this defense is just so passionate around him that eventually, they'll be good enough to go on without him. And definitely think that the additions the Browns have made really make sense to get the most out of him while they can. And right now, the 49ers, even though they've gone farther than each of these teams on these lists in these past couple of years, still feel to me as if they're not doing enough defensively outside of, just hoping Nick Bosa shows up. And, you might slander me in the comments, but that's my humble opinion about as why Nick Bosa just has the burden of carrying this defense. I really like the guys that are there. I really like them. But in order for them to be talked about more, in order for them to be just as exciting as a Nick Bosa, to be as coveted as a Nick Bosa has to figure out why. Why is it me that's getting all this production? Why can't it be my teammates? Because this is going to be a very pivotal year for the San Francisco 49ers, especially defensively. Everyone could be healthy. Everyone could be looking to get that Super Bowl. Everyone wants it in the building. They want the San Francisco 49ers to win the Super Bowl again. In order to do that, it's going to have to be collective unit. And right now, it feels weird that these words are coming out of my mouth. But the San Francisco 49ers felt like the least collectively bonded defenses out of the ones I've mentioned. And it's all because of the Nick Bosa-sized problem they have on their hands. Let's just about do it for this segment. Coming next, we probably have, quote-unquote, the worst player of these five, but I still think he's being completely undervalued in terms of IDP drafts. Tune in to find out who it is when we come back on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our final segment of the day and of the week on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I hope you guys have enjoyed the show this far. I'm really excited to switch to the defensive side of the ball to show you guys how exciting IDP leagues are and how exciting it's going to be come IDP draft time when you have this exciting crop of talent at certain positions on defense. But coming next, we have a guy who I really think a lot of people undervalue, mainly because he's on a defense that's getting to the precipice of being one of the best defenses in the league, but might not be quite there just yet, and that is Bradley Chubb. I look at Micah Parsons and TJ Watt. A lot of people are like, oh yeah, they're no doubters. I'll have them on my draft boards. They're going very high. Bradley Chubb, on the other hand, might not be considered that. And I still think that he's one of the premier linebackers in this league. But maybe there's some disconnect between him and, say, the injury bug that might cause concern for people. So let's jump right into why I think Bradley Chubb is undervalued and why he is. Why he shouldn't be, rather. 515 overall fantasy points for Bradley Chubb. 148.4 last year in his best year and his second in Miami. 30 solo tackles, 7 sacks, 2 fumble recoveries, 73 overall tackles. And I really believe that Bradley Chubb is a guy who, perhaps because whether moving from Denver to Miami, whether the injuries he's had to weather throughout his career, something's missing between his connection with fantasy managers and his results on the field. Because when I look at Bradley Chubb's stats, they're certainly not, Micah Parsons or TJ Watt level stats, but they're certainly above average. And I think that on a Dolphins defense that this year might regress in the mean a little bit, they lost a little depth up front, I really think that Bradley Chubb is ready to stand out, and this could be his statement year. Especially now that he has a partner in Jalen Phillips on the weak side of things that had a breakout season before, unfortunately tearing his Achilles. And what I love about the Dolphins defense is that they're unafraid to recognize that the strength, the forte of their defense is these two linebackers in Chubb and Phillips. And they play their base 3-4. It's a high blitz rate, so you know that they're going to rush the pass, be very aggressive in how they do that. And now that they're building a good secondary, they can do that. And so the connection between Bradley Chubb and Jalen Phillips is perhaps the most important piece to look at when we talk about, the Dolphins as a whole. Because when you put that much power in the hands of these two linebackers, that really offers them a lot. Because When I look at Bradley Chubb and Jalen Phillips as a linebacker duo, I really like Jalen Phillips' length. I like his versatility. I like his size. And when I look at Bradley Chubb, I think of speed, power, aggressiveness, point of attack, just getting to the quarterback in any way possible. And that duo can certainly work. When I look at Micah Parsons, he's a guy who does it by himself. DJ Watt just got Patrick Queen, but that, like I said, that messes around with hierarchy. Right now, these two linebackers, Chubb and Phillips, might become the best linebacker tandem really quickly. And it shocks me that a lot of people might be overlooking them due to the fact that the Dolphins' defense, isn't as intriguing or pretty as the Cowboys and Steelers. But right now, in Bradley Chubb's career, this is the year, in my honest mind, where he just plays like an animal. And no matter where he goes in fantasy drafts, I promise you that by the end of the year, that fantasy drafting will look silly wherever he goes. The draft positioning will look silly. Now, in terms of caveats, with Bradley Chubb, I think that the caveat is, obviously Jalen Phillips could become even better than him. And I could definitely see that happen because Jalen Phillips, before that Achilles injury, was having a career year, finally stepping into that weak side linebacker role. But I really think that the Dolphins don't necessarily have the structure at every level of their defense that other teams have. They certainly are starting to get there, but in terms of structure, in terms of play style, it certainly seems as if they're just learning to work together. And that might be because of the injury bug. And that's another thing that's also a caveat here. The injury bug is kind of hindering how this defense developed because they're right there, in my humble opinion. They have the personnel, and they have the know-how, and they have the system. But A, the injury bug, and B, the fact that all these players, they didn't even get a chance to play with Jalen Ramsey, Chubb, and Phillips, really. And that might lead to them being kind of rocky to start the season. So the Dolphins' defense is really going to be one to keep an eye on, where as the season progresses, you're going to want to see more attack-minded players in Chubb and Phillips, especially in their front as well. And so, looking at how the Dolphins' defense responds to this idea of togetherness, this idea of playing as a full unit, is really going to matter when it comes to how they progress. Because right now, the Dolphins' defense is going to have a little bit of weight on them this year. Because who knows what the offense is going to play like. In a contract year for Tua, a lot of pressure is going to be on him. So they're going to be maybe in a similar situation to the Browns, where they're going to be the unit on their team that's going to have to step up. And they lost a lot of production, like I said. No more Wilkins, no more Van Ginkel, no more, players who really speak to the spirit of what they were trying to build. And so I'm looking at them too. I'm looking at Chubb and Phillips and saying, hey, this is what the defense is now, and you're going to have to lead it, because I see potential in what the Dolphins have. It's just that I'm not necessarily confident that Chubb and Phillips can, when the focus is all on them, really rise to the occasion without, having played a full season together with this team. And, when so much production has been lost. But Bradley Chubb, no matter what, has an opportunity here to make me look fantastic. And for fantasy managers everywhere to rejoice when I say that I told you so when he performs well. And that's all I have for the week and the day and in my IDP player profiles, but that will just about do it for the show. This was the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Please like, follow, and subscribe to this show and the network. It is a huge support to all those involved. Also consider leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. Anything left there is greatly appreciated. I have been Chris Shepard. Thank you guys yet again for tuning in to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. We'll be back next week better than ever. I appreciate you guys. Thank you for tuning in.